Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick.
I'm Ian.
So today we're talking about great and defining albums of the 90s. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give us the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time we release new episodes. So I think the 90s was a really interesting decade for music, just because of how diverse the decade was. And we were both teenagers in the 90s, so I don't know if maybe being teenagers makes us, a little more fonder of the music of that decade, but...
Possibly, because, that's, really, because our teens kind of started at the 90s and went through the 90s, and by the time we hit the end of the 90s, we're starting our 20s.
Yeah.
So we're kind of defined by a lot of that music.
Yeah. And when it comes to, music of the 90s, I think, at least in my opinion, one of the biggest, most defining albums of that decade has to be Nevermind by Nirvana. And I did some little creative editing there to appease the YouTube overlords, but it's just an album that really, it changed music. And I know Nirvana was not the first grunge band. They weren't the first band that was doing music like that, but they were the first one to really break big into the mainstream.
It's kind of the Beatles phenomenon. The Beatles weren't doing anything really that much spectacular above and beyond what people were doing, but they were the first to be big.
Yeah.
They kind of created that. And it's a very similar situation with Nirvana.
Yeah. I think another big album from the early part of the 90s that did the same thing for rap. Obviously Dr. Dre was not the first person to do gangsta style rap, but he was the first to really kind of make it as big as it was in the early part of the 90s. Of course, that album is The Chronic. It's an album I still love today, and I still spin this all the time. He was obviously doing a continuation of what he was doing with the NWA, but it was a different flavor, and, I think he did a better style of what NWA was. Mm-hmm. And obviously this was the big breakthrough album for rap in the mainstream in the early part of the 90s, and so many other albums were inspired by this one.
Yeah, I'm not a big hip-hop or rap guy, but this was obvious. It was, you knew about it. Yeah. Even if you weren't into it, you knew about it.
Yeah. And kind of along the same lines as The Chronic is Doggy Style by Snoop Dogg. This was another album. Obviously, Snoop Dogg got his big break on The Chronic. But I feel like Doggy Style was, in some ways, an even bigger album and a little bit more of an evolution and continuation of what Dr. Dre had done on The Chronic. And there's also so many great features on this album also that gave some of the other artists their break.
I was going to say, I probably have heard this more than I ever heard anything off Chronic.
Yeah.
So, and this kind of launched his career, really.
Yeah,
I know, like you said, he got to start with Dre, but this is how everybody knows about Snoop Dogg.
Yeah.
Going forward and to this day.
Yeah.
So.
I think one of the coolest things about the 90s is there was so much innovation in music outside of rock. And yeah, the next album is part of rock, but as part of that evolution, they really kind of birthed a whole new genre of music. And that's the self-titled debut album from Korn. I know you're not a big Korn
not a
fan.
Big fan, no.
And I'm not a big nu metal fan at all. But I've always...
This is kind of like the first of that.
Yeah, it really was, yeah. And I've always loved this album. And and like I said, it's kind of like when I talk about Ghost. I'm not a big metal guy, but I love Ghost. Korn's the same way. I'm not a big new metal fan of really anything other than their first couple of albums. So in the early part of 1994, I was still primarily listening to, I was still listening to a lot of stuff from the 80s, later part of the 80s. I'd really gotten into grunge, so I was listening to Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Alice in Chains, and a lot of those, Pacific Northwest bands. And then I listened to an album from a band from Southern California, and that album is Dookie by Green Day. And this kind of changed my musical perspective. This was the album that, I think albums like And Out Come the Wolves from Rancid really kind of opened the door up to punk even more than this album did. But this was my entry point into punk.
This was your gateway.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of other people out there also that look at this album the same way, that yes, there were other bigger punk albums in the decade, but this is the one that kind of really started it off.
And to be fair, this really kind of made it mainstream again. Punk had its very brief moment of mainstream in the late 70s and early 80s, but and after that, it kind of went away again, and it wasn't until this where it became like
it was huge. This is the highest selling punk album of all time. It sold over 20 million copies. I mean, it's the album that really defined punk music in the in the 90s and even into the early 2000s. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can really talk about music of the 90s as far as like defining albums without discussing the contribution that female artists had to music in the 90s. So many huge bands and actually just outside of bands, just singer-songwriter stuff. There were so many different female artists that really broke big in the 90s. And I think it was all mainly because of the album Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette. And I'm not the biggest fan. I'm kind of picky when it comes to female artists. I know that probably sounds bad, but this is one of those exceptions because there's not a bad track on here. Yes, there's like some popular stuff that I'm not a huge fan of on here, but there are some great tracks on this album.
Yeah, and for me, it was just I was aware of a few songs because of MTV, but it was talked about. I mean, people were talking about it in the hallways at school, so it had to have some level of defining quality to it.
Yeah. So. And yes, there were female artists before this album came out, but I think as big and as popular as this album got, it really opened up the door for other female artists in the 90s.
I agree.
The 90s also saw the rise of Britpop, at least here in the U.S. And I think to a large extent that had to do with Oasis releasing What's the Story, Morning Glory. It's a great album. I know the Oasis was like trying to do the whole Beatles thing and all that. And I think for the most part it worked, at least in the mainstream here in the U.S. It opened up the doors for so many other big British bands in the later part of the decade. It's just one of those albums I don't think there's a bad track on.
No, I really like this album. I mean, I kind of wish they could, still be making music like this.
Together.
But I would point out that, Britpop isn't Britpop in Britain. It's
I know
Britpop
that.
here.
I know that.
But, again, it's with a lot of these albums, I kind of have to look at it through a very narrow focus or narrow lens of what I was aware of and what was appealing to me at that time. Because I don't pay attention to critics and stuff like that most of the time, especially back then.
Yeah.
But this was, I mean, you had this on. Did you have this on CD?
I guess that.
So I mean, we were always listening to this when you always had that on.
Yeah. And then one last album that I think really helped define the 90s, at least like the later part of the 90s. And it's an album that it took me a while actually to get into. And that's OK Computer by Radiohead. This is a different kind of album. And I know that especially like after grunge died off in the early part of the 90s, I feel like rock music and alternative music went a bunch of different ways.
Yeah.
Some of it was good, some of it not so good. Like I said, just my opinion. But this was an album that everyone loved when it first came out. And I don't know if it was because of how much love this album got that made me kind of not listen to it there for a while. I mean, obviously I knew the hits that were off it, a couple of big singles they had on there. But I didn't really dig into this album until it might have even been like the early part of the 2000s.
Yeah.
But
I came to it late too. I mean, I was always aware of it, and I'm obviously aware of the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
But this was kind of like when they were, like you said, they were branching off, kind of experimenting, and in a good way before they got overly pretentious.
Yeah.
Which is how I would define a lot of their more recent works. But it was, there's a level of pretentiousness to it too. But it was because it was a band stretching its muscles and trying to do new things. And I think that makes it, that's why it's a defining album.
Yeah. And I think the stuff that they tried really worked on this album.
Yeah, I agree. This and Kid A.
Yeah.
After that, it just became pretentious. Yeah.
Well, that's all we got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop us a comment down below. Let us know what you guys think are some of the bigger defining albums of the 90s.
Hundreds, I'm
sure.
sure.
Absolutely. I mean,
we didn't even mention any boy bands, but, let's face it, that was the decade of boy bands.
That's true. And unfortunately, because of my wife, I do have some of those albums. So
you love them and you know it.
Let us know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give us a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all we got. Until next time.
Talk to y'all later.
Keep on spinning. Peace.